There's a particular kind of irony that football seems to enjoy. The sport has a long history of arrangements that look settled on paper right up until the moment they aren't. And right now, in the build-up to the most ambitious World Cup ever staged, something is shifting, quietly but unmistakably, in the balance of power between the three nations that are supposed to be sharing this tournament as equal partners. The 2026 World Cup was always going to be a logistical experiment. 3 countries, 16 cities, 48 teams, 104 matches stretched across a continent. Canada, the United States, and Mexico came together under the United 2026 bid, and they won the hosting rights with a presentation that was, by any measure, impressive. The infrastructure was already there. The stadiums were world-class. The commercial appeal was enormous. FIFA loved it. But here we are, with the tournament now less than a year away, and the picture looks rather different from what many people expected. Because while the United States was always assumed to be the dominant host, the financial engine, the central stage, the country where the final would be played, the ground has been shifting. And Canada and Mexico, for very different reasons, are finding themselves in a stronger position than the original framing of this tournament suggested they would be. To understand why that matters, you have to go back to how this hosting arrangement actually works. This isn't a co-hosted tournament in the way that Japan and South Korea shared 2002, where there was rough parity between two nations. The United States is hosting 11 of the 16 venues. Canada has 2, Toronto and Vancouver. Mexico has 3, Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey. The weight, commercially and logistically, was always tilted heavily toward the United States. That was understood by everyone going in. What wasn't fully anticipated was how certain developments in the United States, some logistical, some political, some diplomatic, would gradually change the atmosphere around the American portion of the tournament, and how in that changing atmosphere, the Canadian and Mexican hosting stories would start to look, relatively speaking, rather cleaner and more straightforward than many expected. Let's start with Canada, because the Canadian hosting story for 2026 has been, in many respects, remarkably smooth. Toronto and Vancouver are 2 of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. They are experienced at hosting major international events. Vancouver hosted the Winter Olympics in 2010. Toronto has been a regular destination for international football friendlies and major sporting events for years. The infrastructure is solid, the public transport is reliable, and, perhaps most importantly, given the broader context of this tournament, both cities have reputations as genuinely welcoming destinations for fans from every part of the world. And that last point matters more in 2026 than it might have in any previous World Cup, because one of the complications that has emerged around the American portion of the tournament involves exactly that question: the ease or otherwise of getting into the country. Visa processes, entry requirements, and the general atmosphere of travel to the United States have become topics of genuine concern for fans from certain parts of the world. These aren't imaginary concerns, they're practical ones, and they're being discussed openly in football communities across Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Canada, by contrast, has not been part of that conversation in the same way. The entry process for fans traveling to Toronto or Vancouver is, for most nationalities, more straightforward. And while the group stage matches held in Canadian cities may not have the weight of a semifinal or a final, the fan experience surrounding those games is shaping up to be genuinely excellent. Early indicators from local organizers, from FIFA's own logistics assessments, and from the travel and hospitality industry suggest that the Canadian venues are generating real enthusiasm. Not the dutiful enthusiasm of a co-host trying to keep up, but genuine excitement. What do you remember from the 2002 World Cup, from the Japan versus South Korea dynamic, and how expectations about the two hosts evolved as the tournament unfolded? It's worth thinking about because 2026 may produce something similar. Now let's talk about Mexico, because the Mexican story is arguably the most interesting of the 3, and the one that has surprised the most people. Mexico City's Estadio Azteca is one of the most storied grounds in football history. It hosted the 1970 World Cup final. It hosted the 1986 World Cup final. Pelé played there. Maradona's hand of God happened there. The greatest goal ever scored, by most people's reckoning, was scored there, when Maradona dribbled from his own half and beat 5 England players before placing the ball past Peter Shilton in the quarterfinal of 1986. To say the Azteca carries history is to understate it almost comically. But when Mexico was confirmed as part of the 2026 hosting arrangement, there were genuine questions. Structural concerns had been raised about the Azteca itself. It required significant renovation work to meet FIFA's modern standards. Guadalajara and Monterrey were solid venues, but the logistical questions around security, infrastructure, and crowd management in Mexico were being discussed seriously in football circles. What has happened since then is that Mexico, by most accounts, has delivered. The renovation work on the Azteca has progressed. The local organizing committees in all 3 Mexican cities have worked through the operational planning with a level of professionalism that has impressed FIFA's technical observers. And there's something else, something less tangible, but perhaps more important, which is the appetite for this tournament in Mexico is extraordinary. Football in Mexico isn't a hobby. It isn't a weekend pastime. It's embedded in the culture at a depth that even the most passionate European football nations would recognize and respect. The prospect of hosting World Cup matches, including the opening match of the entire tournament, which is scheduled to be played at the Azteca, has generated a level of national anticipation that you can feel even through a screen. The opening match of the 2026 World Cup at the Azteca will be one of the great moments in the history of the tournament. That ground, with that history, in that city, for a game of that significance. If you are a football fan of 50-something or 60-something years old and you remember watching the 1986 final on television, you will understand exactly what that means. And here's the thing that's been quietly changing the narrative around Mexico's role in this tournament. FIFA has been paying attention to the enthusiasm, the operational progress, and the global appetite for the Mexican venues. And the conversation has shifted, not formally, not in any official announcement, but in the texture of how the tournament is being discussed internally and in football journalism, toward a sense that Mexico is punching above its weight in this hosting arrangement, that the 3 Mexican cities are not the junior partners in this deal. They're something closer to equal contributors, and in terms of the emotional and historical weight they bring, perhaps more than that. This brings us to the heart of what's actually changed, because the 2026 World Cup was presented from the beginning as an American tournament with Canadian and Mexican support. That was the underlying assumption, not stated explicitly, but present in how the commercial deals were structured, in where FIFA positioned its headquarters for the event, in the distribution of matches, and in the general media framing of what this tournament was going to be. That framing is now being quietly revised, not because anything has gone catastrophically wrong in the United States. The American venues are extraordinary: the Rose Bowl, MetLife Stadium, AT&T Stadium, Levi's Stadium, the Hard Rock in Miami. These are elite facilities. The commercial infrastructure around the American portion of the tournament is unmatched anywhere in the world. The television deals, the sponsorship arrangements, the hospitality packages, it's all at a scale that only the United States can deliver in 2026. But the story of this tournament has become more complicated than the original script suggested. The diplomatic tensions around certain nations' participation, the conversations about visa access, the logistical complexity of managing a tournament across 3 very different countries with 3 very different governmental and regulatory environments. All of that has created space for Canada and Mexico to become more visible, more valued, and in some respects more central to the World Cup experience than the original architecture of the event suggested they would be. And there's a sporting dimension to this too, one that deserves more attention than it sometimes gets. Both Canada and Mexico have qualified for the tournament as hosts, but their footballing stories heading into 2026 are genuinely compelling in their own right. Canada's men's national team had one of the most remarkable qualification campaigns in CONCACAF history for the 2022 World Cup, finishing top of the final CONCACAF standings for the first time ever. That generation of players, Alphonso Davies, Jonathan David, Tajon Buchanan, and others, brought a new level of ambition and quality to Canadian football. The expectation for 2026 is that Canada will not simply be making up the numbers on home soil. They will be genuine competitors, and the atmosphere in Toronto and Vancouver for their group stage matches is going to be extraordinary. Mexico's relationship with the World Cup is its own kind of story. The famous Quinto Partido, the fifth match, has haunted Mexican football for decades. Mexico has reached the quarterfinals in 1970 and 1986, both times as hosts, and has exited at the round of 16 in every subsequent tournament. Whether 2026, again on home soil, breaks that pattern is one of the genuine narrative threads of this tournament, and it's a thread that Mexican fans are intensely aware of. So where does all of this leave us as we move through the final months of preparation? The honest answer is that 2026 is shaping up to be something more genuinely multilateral than the original concept suggested. Canada has earned a reputation as a reliable, welcoming, high-quality host. Mexico has reminded the football world why its cities, its grounds, and its fans belong at the center of the game's biggest moment. And the United States, despite the complications, still provides the commercial and logistical backbone that makes a tournament of this size possible. What we're looking at increasingly is a World Cup with three distinct characters. The American venues will deliver spectacle and scale. The Canadian cities will deliver warmth and inclusivity. And the Mexican grounds, especially the Azteca, will deliver history and emotion in a way that nothing else in this tournament can match. And perhaps that's exactly what a 48-team World Cup means. Not one dominant host with two supporting acts, but three genuinely different experiences that together create something larger than any of them could produce alone. The conversations happening now in FIFA's technical committees, in the national organizing bodies, in the football media across three continents are increasingly acknowledging that Canada and Mexico have grown into this tournament in ways that weren't fully anticipated. The balance of influence, of narrative, and of footballing meaning has shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that changes the fundamental structure of the event, but meaningfully, noticeably, in a way that any genuine football observer can see. Whether that shift continues as the tournament begins, whether the opening match at the Azteca sets a tone that carries through, whether Canada produces a moment that makes their home ground unforgettable, whether the American venues deliver the final and the semi-final moments that justify their central place in the design of this event, that's what the next 12 months will answer. For now, what's clear is that the story of 2026 isn't simply an American story with footnotes from the North and South. It's a continental story. And the continent is more interesting, more complicated, and more full of genuine football than the original headline suggested. I'd genuinely love to know which part of this tournament you're most looking forward to. The Azteca opening match, a Canadian upset in front of a home crowd, the final at MetLife? Tell me in the comments. I read everything, and this is exactly the kind of conversation I want to keep having. If this is the kind of football discussion you've been looking for, no shouting, no clickbait, just a game taken seriously, then subscribe. There's a lot more of this to come between now and June. Football at this scale is never just a tournament. It's a moment in time, and 2026 is going to be one of them.